The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked slowly toward the ceremonial guards stationed at the main entrance. His small hands clutched a handwritten letter, the edges slightly crumpled from his nervous grip. The young prince had been awake since dawn, rehearsing the words he wanted to say to the guards who had become such a familiar part of his daily life. Guard Captain James Mitchell stood at attention, his red uniform pristine and his expression stoic as always. He had served the royal family for over 15 years, watching Prince George grow from a toddler taking his first wobbly steps in the palace gardens to the thoughtful young boy he had become. The other guards, Sergeant Williams and Corporal Davies, maintained their positions flanking the entrance, but George could sense their subtle awareness of his approach. The previous evening, Prince George had overheard a conversation between his parents, Prince William and Princess Catherine, discussing the upcoming changes to the palace security arrangements. Budget constraints and modernization efforts meant that some of the traditional ceremonial guard positions would be reduced. The familiar faces that had greeted George every morning for years would soon be reassigned to other duties or different locations. As George approached Captain Mitchell, he noticed the slight softening around the guard's eyes, though his posture remained perfectly military. The captain had always maintained professional distance, but over the years, small moments had created an unspoken bond. There were the mornings when George would wave from his bedroom window and Captain Mitchell would offer the slightest nod in return. During state visits, when George felt overwhelmed by the formality and crowds, he would catch sight of the familiar red uniform and feel a sense of stability. "Captain Mitchell," George began, his voice carrying the careful pronunciation his tutors had taught him, yet tinged with genuine emotion. "I have something I would like to give you." The captain's training prevented him from breaking protocol, but his eyes showed curiosity and warmth as the young prince extended the letter. George had spent hours the night before, writing and rewriting his thoughts, wanting to express something he had never put into words before. "I know you and the other guards will be leaving soon," George continued, glancing at Sergeant Williams and Corporal Davies, who, despite their training, couldn't help but listen intently. "I wanted you to know that seeing you here every day has made me feel safe and happy. You've been like silent friends who were always there, even when I didn't realize I needed friends." The letter contained more than just words of gratitude. George had drawn small pictures of the guards at their posts, showing moments he remembered. Captain Mitchell standing firm during a thunderstorm, Sergeant Williams helping when George's ball had rolled near the entrance, and Corporal Davies, who had once discreetly pointed out a butterfly to distract George during a difficult day when photographers were being particularly intrusive. Captain Mitchell accepted the letter with a slight bow of his head, a gesture that somehow conveyed both military respect and personal appreciation. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Here was a young boy who would one day inherit tremendous responsibility, taking time to recognize those who served his family with quiet dedication. "Your Royal Highness," Captain Mitchell said, his voice maintaining its professional tone while carrying unmistakable warmth. "Serving your family has been the greatest honor of my career. Watching you grow into the thoughtful young man you are today has been a privilege beyond measure." The other guards, while maintaining their positions, seemed to stand a little straighter, their pride evident in their bearing. This wasn't just a goodbye from any child. This was acknowledgement from someone who understood, even at his young age, the value of service and loyalty. George stepped back, but instead of returning immediately to the palace, he stood quietly for a moment looking at each guard individually. He was memorizing their faces, their presence, understanding that this chapter of his childhood was closing. The security changes weren't just about budget or efficiency, they represented the evolving nature of the monarchy and his own growing up. As the morning progressed, word of the young prince's gesture began to spread quietly through the palace staff. The housekeepers, gardeners, and other employees had all witnessed the exchange from windows and doorways, touched by the maturity and kindness displayed by someone so young. Princess Catherine, who had been watching discreetly from an upper window, felt a surge of pride in her son's character. The letter itself would become a treasured possession for Captain Mitchell, but its impact extended far beyond personal sentiment. It represented a bridge between tradition and change, between the formal requirements of royal protocol and the human connections that give meaning to service. George had instinctively understood something that many adults struggle with, that acknowledging others' contributions with sincere gratitude creates bonds that transcend hierarchy and circumstance. The afternoon brought additional responsibilities for George: lessons with his tutors, piano practice, and time in the garden with his younger siblings Charlotte and Louis. But throughout these activities, his mind returned to the morning's interaction with the guards. He found himself thinking about the nature of service, duty, and the relationships that form even within the most formal structures. That evening, during dinner with his family, George shared his feelings about the guard changes with his parents and siblings. His thoughtfulness sparked a family discussion about transitions, the importance of expressing gratitude, and how even small gestures can have significant meaning. Prince William spoke about his own experiences with palace staff over the years, emphasizing how these relationships had shaped his understanding of leadership and responsibility. As bedtime approached, George looked out his bedroom window toward the guard posts, knowing that soon they would look different. Change was inevitable, but the connections formed and the lessons learned would remain with him. The young prince was beginning to understand that his future role would involve countless such moments, opportunities to recognize others, to bridge differences, and to find humanity within formality. The day had started with a simple desire to say goodbye properly, but it had become something more profound. George had taken his first real step toward understanding the weight and privilege of his position, not in terms of power or ceremony, but in terms of his ability to touch lives and create meaningful connections with those who serve alongside him in the unique world of the British royal family. 3 weeks had passed since Prince George's heartfelt goodbye to the ceremonial guards, and the changes at Windsor Castle were becoming more apparent each day. The new security arrangements involved fewer visible guards and more discreet protection, reflecting modern approaches to royal security. While the palace still maintained its grandeur and protocol, the familiar red uniforms were now a less frequent sight in the daily routines of the royal family. George found himself adjusting to these changes in ways he hadn't expected. His morning walks through the palace corridors felt different without the reassuring presence of Captain Mitchell and his team at their traditional posts. The new security personnel were professional and efficient, but they operated with a different philosophy: less ceremonial presence, more invisible protection. During this period of adjustment, an unexpected letter arrived for Prince George through the palace's formal correspondence system. The envelope bore the official seal of the British Army, and inside was a carefully handwritten note from Captain Mitchell. The former guard had been reassigned to a training facility where he was preparing new recruits for royal protection duties. His letter expressed gratitude for George's kindness and shared something that surprised the young prince. Captain Mitchell wrote about how George's gesture had inspired him to establish a new training program that emphasized the human element of royal service. He was teaching new guards not just about protocol and security procedures, but about the importance of understanding the individuals they protect. The letter included photographs of young soldiers learning about royal history and the significance of their roles beyond mere duty. This news sparked something unexpected in George's mind. He began to think about the broader impact of his actions and how individual gestures could create ripple effects extending far beyond their immediate context. His tutors noticed his increased interest in discussions about leadership, service, and social responsibility during their lessons. Princess Catherine observed her son's thoughtful mood and arranged a special outing that she hoped might provide both education and inspiration. She planned a visit to a veterans' hospital where former military personnel received care and rehabilitation services. The visit wasn't part of any official royal engagement. Instead, it was designed as a learning experience for George to understand different aspects of service and sacrifice. The hospital visit proved to be transformative for the young prince. He met veterans from various conflicts who had served the crown in different capacities throughout their careers. Some had been palace guards like Captain Mitchell, while others had served in overseas deployments or domestic security roles. Their stories painted a picture of service that extended far beyond what George had previously understood. One veteran, retired Sergeant Major Patricia Holmes, had served as a guard at Buckingham Palace during the early years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. She shared stories about the evolution of royal protection over decades, helping George understand that change in royal security wasn't new or unusual, but rather an ongoing process of adaptation to meet contemporary needs while preserving essential traditions. Another veteran, former Corporal David Chen, had transitioned from military service to become a teacher in an inner-city school. He spoke with George about how his military training in discipline, respect, and service had translated into his work with young people facing various challenges. His perspective helped George see connections between different forms of service and their common underlying values. During lunch at the hospital, George found himself in conversation with Maria Santos, a physiotherapist who worked with veteran patients. She wasn't a former military member herself, but her dedication to helping veterans recover and rebuild their lives represented another form of service. Her stories about small daily victories and the importance of patience and encouragement resonated with George's recent experiences. The visit concluded with George participating in a recreational activity session where veterans were engaged in art therapy and creative projects. He watched former soldiers and guards express themselves through painting, writing, and music, seeing aspects of their personalities that had been hidden behind years of military discipline and protocol. One particularly moving moment occurred when a veteran named Thomas Wright, who had served as a Royal Guard in the 1990s, showed George a scrapbook he had been creating. The book contained newspaper clippings, photographs, and personal memories from his years of service. Among the pages was a photograph of a very young Prince William with his mother, Princess Diana, taken during a palace event that Thomas had helped to secure. This connection to his own family's history through the eyes of someone who had served them created a profound moment of understanding for George. He began to grasp how individual lives and service records intertwined with royal history in ways that were both personal and institutional. The guards he had said goodbye to weren't just changing jobs. They were part of a continuing tradition of service that connected past, present, and future. On the drive back to Windsor Castle, George was unusually quiet, processing the day's experiences. Princess Catherine could see that her son was working through complex thoughts and emotions. When she gently asked about his reflections, George expressed amazement at how many different ways people found to serve others and contribute to something larger than themselves. That evening, George made an unexpected request to his parents. He wanted to create a project that would help him stay connected with the veterans he had met and learn more about the broader community of people who had served the royal family over the years. This wasn't just about the recent guard changes. It had evolved into a deeper interest in understanding the network of service that supported the monarchy. Prince William and Princess Catherine were impressed by their son's initiative and agreed to help him develop this project in age-appropriate ways. They arranged for George to receive regular updates from the Veterans Hospital and established a correspondence system that would allow him to maintain contact with some of the veterans he had met. The project also included a research component where George would learn about the history of royal service, from medieval knights to modern security personnel. His tutors integrated this interest into his regular lessons, using it as a vehicle for teaching history, civics, and social responsibility. As the weeks continued, George's understanding of his own future role began to deepen and mature. The simple act of saying goodbye to familiar guards had opened doorways to comprehending the vast network of individuals whose lives intersected with royal duty. He was beginning to see himself not as someone who would be served, but as someone who would need to understand, appreciate, and support those who chose to dedicate their careers to royal service. The transformation in George's perspective didn't go unnoticed by the palace staff. Housekeepers, gardeners, kitchen workers, and administrative personnel began to see changes in how the young prince interacted with them. He showed increased interest in their work, asked thoughtful questions about their responsibilities, and demonstrated appreciation for their contributions in ways that felt genuine rather than merely polite. This growing awareness was preparing George for a future where his role would require him to understand and connect with people from all walks of life. The guard changes that had initially seemed like a simple goodbye had become the catalyst for a much broader education in leadership, service, and human connection that would serve him throughout his life. 6 months after the initial guard changes at Windsor Castle, Prince George's understanding of service and leadership had continued to evolve in remarkable ways. His correspondence with veterans from the hospital visit had become a regular part of his weekly routine, and the insights he gained from these exchanges were influencing his approach to his royal education and daily interactions within the palace. The most significant development came when George learned that his gesture toward Captain Mitchell had inspired changes beyond what anyone had initially anticipated. The captain's new training program for royal protection personnel had gained attention from senior military officials and palace administrators. The program's emphasis on understanding the human side of royal service was being considered for implementation across all royal households, not just Windsor Castle. This news reached George through an unexpected visit from his grandfather, King Charles III, who had been following his grandson's growing interest in royal service and tradition. The king had always taken a special interest in George's education, but this conversation marked a new level of engagement between them. They sat in the palace library, surrounded by centuries of royal history, discussing concepts that bridged George's childhood experiences with his future responsibilities. King Charles explained how the monarchy's relationship with its staff and security personnel had evolved over generations, always balancing tradition with the practical needs of changing times. He shared stories from his own childhood, describing similar moments when he had come to understand the human connections that made royal life both possible and meaningful. The king emphasized that George's instinctive response to the guard changes demonstrated qualities essential for future royal leadership. During this conversation, George learned about plans for a new initiative that would formalize recognition of long-term royal service members. The initiative would create opportunities for royals of all ages to understand and appreciate the diverse roles that supported their families' public duties. George's interest in staying connected with veterans and current staff members had provided a model for how this recognition could work in practice. The king proposed that George take on a special role in developing this initiative, appropriate for his age and experience level. This wouldn't be a formal royal duty, but rather a learning project that could help shape both the program and George's understanding of his future responsibilities. The prospect of contributing to something meaningful excited George, while also making him feel the weight of real responsibility for the first time. Over the following weeks, George worked with palace staff and his tutors to develop his contribution to the Service Recognition Initiative. His project involved creating a collection of stories and testimonials from current and former royal staff members documenting the diverse ways people had contributed to royal life over the decades. This work required George to conduct interviews, research historical records, and learn about palace operations he had never previously considered. One of his most enlightening interviews was with Mrs. Eleanor Davies, who had served as a palace housekeeper for over 30 years. She had started working at Buckingham Palace as a young woman during Queen Elizabeth II's reign and had witnessed tremendous changes in royal operations over the decades. Her stories provided George with insights into how the monarchy functioned from perspectives he had never imagined. Mrs. Davies told George about the careful coordination required for state visits, the attention to detail needed for formal ceremonies, and the genuine friendships that developed among staff members who spent their careers serving the royal family. She also spoke about challenges and changes, helping George understand that evolution in royal operations was constant and necessary, not something to be feared or resisted. Another significant interview was with James Patterson, a palace chef who had been responsible for royal meals during countless official events and private family gatherings. Chef Patterson's perspective helped George appreciate the complexity of seemingly simple aspects of royal life. He learned about dietary requirements for international guests, the logistics of serving formal dinners for hundreds of people, and the personal touches that made family meals special despite the grandeur of palace surroundings. These interviews were teaching George to ask thoughtful questions and listen carefully to answers, skills that would serve him well in future royal engagements. He was also learning to see palace life through multiple perspectives, understanding that his family's daily routine required coordination and dedication from hundreds of people working in various capacities. The most emotionally significant part of George's project came when he received a letter from Captain Mitchell announcing that he would be visiting Windsor Castle for a special ceremony. The captain's training program had been officially adopted as a model for royal protection services, and he was being recognized for his innovative approach to combining traditional military discipline with enhanced understanding of royal family dynamics. The ceremony took place in the same courtyard where George had said goodbye to the ceremonial guards months earlier. This time, however, the event celebrated continuity and evolution rather than endings. Captain Mitchell was presented with a commendation for his service, and his new trainees demonstrated the enhanced protocols they had learned through his program. Prince George was invited to participate in the ceremony, not as a passive observer, but as someone whose actions had contributed to the positive changes being celebrated. He presented Captain Mitchell with a special edition of the story collection he had been developing, which included the captain's own account of his years serving the royal family and his vision for future royal protection training. During his brief speech at the ceremony, George reflected on what he had learned about service, change, and human connections over the past months. His words were carefully prepared with help from his tutors, but they reflected genuine understanding and appreciation. He spoke about discovering that goodbye doesn't always mean ending, but sometimes means transformation into something new and valuable. The audience for George's speech included not only the guards and palace staff, but also some of the veterans he had met during his hospital visit and family members who had supported his learning project. Seeing these different groups gathered together helped George understand how his simple gesture months earlier had created connections and opportunities that extended far beyond anything he had originally imagined. Following the ceremony, George's parents and grandparents expressed their pride in his growth and maturity. They had watched him develop from a child who simply wanted to say goodbye properly to a young person, beginning to understand the responsibilities and opportunities that came with his future role. His project had demonstrated qualities of leadership, empathy, and dedication that would serve him well throughout his life. The service recognition initiative that George had helped develop became a permanent part of royal operations, ensuring that future generations would have systematic ways to understand and appreciate the contributions of all who served the monarchy. George's collection of stories and interviews became the foundation for educational materials used in royal staff training and family education programs. As autumn arrived at Windsor Castle, George reflected on how much had changed since that morning when he had approached Captain Mitchell with a simple letter of gratitude. The guards at the palace entrances looked different now. The security arrangements had been modernized, and his own understanding of royal life had deepened considerably. But the core values that had motivated his original gesture, respect, appreciation, and human connection, had remained constant throughout all the changes. Looking ahead, George understood that his future would involve countless similar moments of transition and growth. Each change would bring opportunities to learn, to connect with others, and to contribute positively to the institutions and traditions he would eventually inherit. His experience with the guard changes had provided him with tools and perspectives that would help him navigate these future challenges with wisdom and compassion. The young prince had learned that leadership wasn't about giving orders or maintaining distance, but about understanding, appreciating, and supporting those who shared in the work of serving something larger than themselves. This lesson, learned through a childhood goodbye, would influence his approach to royal responsibility for the rest of his life, ensuring that tradition and innovation could work together to create meaningful connections across all levels of royal service.